The morning of Sunday, April 26, 2009, in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, a 25-year-old woman named Heather Strube sat with her boyfriend, Mike, at the kitchen table of Mike's home. Heather and Mike had been dating for a year, but somehow everything still felt fresh and new, and Heather wished she could just spend all day with Mike. But this Sunday, Heather had plans. She was going to church, then to do some chores at her house, and then she would pick up her 19-month-old son from his father. She knew, in theory, she could skip church in order to spend a little more time with Mike. But for Heather, skipping church was like missing a meal. Whenever she did it, she ended up with an empty feeling in her stomach. So, after taking her last bite, Heather stood up and dropped her dishes in the sink, kissed Mike on the forehead, told him she loved him, and walked out the door. Heather drove across town to church, went inside, sat down in a long wooden pew, and waited for the service to start. Church had always been an important part of Heather's life. In fact, she was convinced that if it wasn't for church, she never would have been born, because Heather's parents had first met and fallen in love at a Presbyterian church camp. That was why, when Heather was a teenager, it had felt like fate when she went to youth group and fell in love with a young classmate named Stephen Strube. Heather and Stephen had connected right away. They dated for several years and always talked about their future together. And then in May of 2004, they got married. At first, life had been good for the young couple. Heather and her parents opened a flower shop, and Heather worked there every day. She had always loved flowers, and being around them just made her happy. And the flower shop was a true family business. Stephen would often come by to help out at the shop, and his mother, Joanna, she would even pitch in when things got really busy. And in September of 2007, the family grew when Heather and Stephen had a baby boy. They named him Carson, and Heather felt like God had truly blessed her and her family. But now, sitting in church, Heather did not feel so blessed anymore. She was vaguely aware that the preacher had started the service, but she was barely listening. She was only thinking about Carson. Heather had not seen her son all weekend, and she hated the days when she wasn't with him. And she blamed her now soon-to-be ex-husband, Stephen, for keeping them apart. Heather and Stephen's happy life had fallen apart just months after Carson was born. One day at the flower shop, Stephen's mom, Joanna, had come across a receipt for some jewelry that Stephen had bought. Joanna figured the jewelry had been a gift for Heather, and she thought Heather might want the receipt to keep track of the family finances. But when Heather looked at the receipt, she'd been really confused. She didn't recognize the jewelry that was listed on the receipt. Stephen had never given her anything like that. And that's when she realized Stephen must be cheating on her, and he had bought this jewelry for some other woman. And when she confronted him about it, Stephen admitted to everything. Heather had at least wanted to try to make the marriage work, but Stephen told her he had a new girlfriend and he wanted a divorce. Now, in church, Heather realized the preacher was finishing up his sermon, and she saw everyone standing up around her. She felt bad for not having paid much attention, so she stood up and smiled and spent an extra few minutes talking to other members of the congregation. And after the service was over, as Heather walked to her car, she told herself not to dwell on all the negative things in her life. Even though her marriage had fallen apart, God still provided for her. She had a great new boyfriend, she was part of a church filled with people who loved and cared about her, and she had a beautiful little boy. At around 6 p.m. that night, Heather drove across town to pick up Carson. But the little bit of hope she had started to feel after church had now disappeared, and she felt uneasy. She always felt like this when seeing Stephen, because their custody swap meetings had been tense from the beginning. Nearly every single time Heather and Stephen met to hand off Carson, they would get into an argument. The baby lived with Heather, and Stephen had him every other weekend, but Stephen had been arguing for joint custody because he wanted Carson to live with him half the time. The fights between the parents had gotten so bad at one point that Heather had insisted on doing the custody swaps in the parking lot of a busy shopping center. Recently, though, the animosity had sort of leveled off. Stephen just wanted to be done with the divorce proceedings, so he had finally agreed to allow Heather full custody of their son. Still, though, Heather preferred to meet Stephen in public. When Heather pulled into the Target parking lot in the city of Snellville, Georgia that night, she saw Stephen was already there, waiting outside of his car. So Heather parked and then walked over to him. Stephen said a quick hello, and he lifted Carson out of his car and handed him over to Heather. And without saying anything else, Stephen got back in his car and drove out of the lot. But Heather was so happy to have her son back, she didn't even care that Stephen had barely acknowledged her. She had a huge smile on her face and talked to Carson as she carried him to her SUV. She opened the rear passenger door and carefully secured him in his car seat. Heather shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, and she heard footsteps coming up behind her. Heather turned around, and she was startled to see a strange-looking man standing there. He had wild hair and a thick mustache, and he had a messenger bag strapped around his shoulder. This man spoke to Heather, and when she heard what he said, she lunged for the door and tried to open it. Seconds later, shoppers in this busy Target parking lot heard the loud bang of a gunshot. Some of the shoppers just froze in complete terror, and others took off running and screaming, afraid the shooter would keep on firing. But a couple of the shoppers immediately turned in the direction of the sound, and they saw a man with wild hair calmly walking away from an SUV towards the woods that surrounded the shopping center. These shoppers rushed over to the SUV, and when they saw a woman slumped on the ground and blood covering her face, they called 911. Officer Neil Carter of the Snellville Police was patrolling in his cruiser not far from the target when he heard the call come through on the police radio. Carter instantly spun a U-turn and stepped on the gas. When he pulled into the Target parking lot, he saw a group of people already heading towards his car. Carter parked, stepped outside, and then walked directly into complete chaos. Everybody in the parking lot, all these people who had just been doing some Sunday shopping before they witnessed a shooting, descended on Officer Carter. And they were shouting and trying to tell him what they saw, but there were so many of them, and they were all so upset that Carter couldn't understand anything they were telling him. Carter held up his hands and told them to please step back. He needed everyone to calm down. But a few people in the crowd just kept on shouting. Clearly, they had something truly urgent, and they pointed Carter towards a parked SUV. Carter looked over and saw a woman's body lying on the ground by that SUV. He ran to her, but even from a few feet away, he could see the woman had been shot. Carter reached down to feel the woman's pulse, but he already knew she was dead. When Carter stood back up, he saw a woman from the crowd coming towards him, shouting. But this time, Carter understood exactly what he was hearing. This woman was shouting, "There's a baby in the back seat." Carter felt his heartbeat spike. He turned around and peered through the window, bracing himself for the sight of an injured child. Instead, to his relief, he saw a little boy, maybe a year and a half old, staring back at him with wide eyes. The little boy looked scared, but he was unharmed. Carter opened the door of the SUV, lifted up the boy, still in the car seat, and carried him to his police cruiser, setting him down in the back. At this point, Carter saw a wave of police and first responders arriving, and he saw the crowd rushing towards them like they did to him. Carter just looked at the baby in the back of his police car. Carter could barely think straight, and he wasn't sure what to do next. But at least this little boy was safe. Just then, Carter heard shouting behind him again, and he turned and saw another woman approaching him, waving her arms to get his attention. His first impulse was to tell her to stay back, but she pointed to a spot near the edge of the parking lot, and she said she had seen the shooter standing there before the shooting. This could be a solid lead, so Carter quickly refocused and started writing down the woman's account in his notebook. She said the shooter had been watching the victim from nearby, on the other side of a few parked cars. He was a short, slender man with an odd mustache and wild black hair, and he was wearing khaki pants and a blue button-up shirt. Carter thanked the woman and then shared her description of the shooter to the other officers at the scene. Carter stayed behind and arranged for the baby to be taken to the police station, while other officers fanned out and began searching the area around the target with canine units, hoping to find the suspect. The police dogs led their handlers to the edge of the parking lot and then followed a scent through the woods surrounding the target into the parking lot of an adjacent hotel. But that's where the dogs lost the trail. The police figured the killer must have gotten into a vehicle parked at that location and driven off. Just beyond the hotel parking lot was a highway, and the officers knew that by now, the killer was probably miles away. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Officer Carter found the victim's purse with her license inside of it. Now they had an ID. Her name was Heather Strube. Soon after Officer Carter identified Heather, Lieutenant Trey Downs of the Snellville Police Department arrived at the Target parking lot. The place was still pretty chaotic, with police officers, witnesses, first responders, and police dogs spread out everywhere, but Lieutenant Downs looked completely unfazed by any of it. He quickly met with Officer Carter to get an update and also a description of the shooter. Then he walked right towards the target. As he got closer, he saw several security cameras mounted on the roof of the store pointing down at the parking lot, and he smiled. Downs had already figured that this store would have decent security, and now he believed these specific cameras would be the key to finding the shooter. Inside the store, Downs flagged down an employee and told her that he needed to see the security footage for the entire day. The employee led him through the store to a cramped room filled with multiple security screens. A man was already hunched over the screens, watching the scene currently unfolding in the parking lot. That man introduced himself to Downs as the director of security. Downs told him that he needed to see everything the cameras had picked up that evening, so the security director pulled up the footage. At first, as Downs examined each camera angle, he was disappointed. There were no cameras aimed directly at where Heather had parked, and so there was no footage of the actual shooting. But as he looked closely at the footage that they did have, Downs spotted a man who perfectly matched the description of the shooter. The man entered the parking lot on foot, walked in the direction of Heather's SUV, and a short time after, walked away toward the surrounding woods. The footage was low resolution. Downs asked if he could have the footage so he could send it off to the crime lab for possible enhancement. But the security director surprised him by saying that Target actually had its own forensics lab that was so good, Target had actually closed cases that even the FBI couldn't solve. The security director promised he'd get the footage out first thing in the morning and get the process started. Downs said that would be a huge help, and he headed out of the store. The sun was setting, and the parking lot looked calm and empty compared to how it had been when Downs first arrived. He saw crime scene investigators packing up their equipment for the night. One of them had called him over to tell him that Heather had been shot with a .38 caliber revolver, but the weapon itself had not been found at the scene, and neither had any clear fingerprints. This was not the news Downs was hoping for. So far, he had a good physical description of the suspect and some blurry video, but not much else. But he figured he did have at least one other thing to go on. This shooting did not appear to be a random attack. Downs believed Heather had been targeted. Heather's parents were out of town, driving through Alabama, when Heather's mom's cell phone began to ring. She picked it up and heard the voice of her father, Heather's grandfather, on the other end, and his voice was shaking. He told her that he had just been visited by the police, and he had some horrible news that he could barely even believe was true. The police had brought Carson to his house and told him that Heather had been murdered. Heather's mom screamed and hung up the phone. Heather's dad, who was driving, asked her what was going on. Heather's mom could barely get the words out, but she told him that their daughter had been killed. Heather's dad pulled over to the side of the road, and the two parents just sat there and wept. Then they turned the car around and began making the trip back home to Georgia. Several hours later, late on the night of the murder, Heather's parents walked into the Snellville police station and saw Lieutenant Downs waiting for them. Heather's parents looked completely dazed, like they barely knew where they were. They'd sped home from Alabama, almost without saying a word to each other. It was almost like if they didn't talk about what had happened, maybe it wasn't real. But earlier, they had gone right to Heather's grandfather's house, and when they saw him sitting with Heather's little boy in his lap, it had hit them. They had lost their daughter, and Carson had lost his mom. At the station, Lieutenant Downs said he was deeply sorry for their loss. He understood they were grieving and in shock, but every second counted in a homicide investigation, and so he couldn't wait to ask them questions. Heather's parents said they understood, and they followed Downs to his office and sat across from him at his desk. First, Downs wanted to know if they knew what their daughter was doing at the Target that evening. Was she just shopping? Heather's mom shook her head. She said Heather and her husband Stephen were separated, and they met at Target to hand off their son as part of their custody agreement. The custody battle had been ugly, she said. She paused, and in a quiet voice, she asked Lieutenant Downs if he thought Stephen could have had something to do with Heather's death. Downs was not surprised by this question. A husband going through a divorce was almost always suspect number one in a murder like this. It was his first thought too. But as an investigator, he liked to keep his evidence and theories under wraps as much as possible. But he did tell Heather's mom that they had a good description of the shooter and it didn't match Stephen. And beyond that, Stephen had been seen driving away from the parking lot at the exact time the killer approached. So no, he said, he did not think Stephen was the shooter. What Downs didn't say was that he had not ruled out the possibility that Stephen had hired someone else to kill his estranged wife. Downs told Heather's parents he just needed one more thing: a list of all the people who knew that Heather would be in that parking lot at that time of day for the custody swap. And after thinking for a few minutes, Heather's parents came up with about a dozen people, and Downs wrote down all the names. Downs told them again how sorry he was, and then he walked them out of the police station. Downs went back to his office and read over the list Heather's parents had just given him, and he decided there was no way around it. The only person it made sense to start with was Heather's estranged husband, Stephen Strube. The next morning, Lieutenant Downs and another officer arrived at a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. This was Stephen's mom's house, and Downs discovered Stephen had started staying here after he and Heather had split up. Downs had barely slept, but nobody would ever know. He looked sharp and full of energy. He knocked on the door, and a young man answered it. Downs asked him if he was Stephen Strube, but the young man just said no, turned around, and walked away. Downs looked at the other officer, a little confused by what had just happened. Downs was about to shout at the young man to come back and talk to them when a middle-aged man walked up to the door and asked if he could help. So Downs asked him if Stephen was home, and the man laughed. He said, yes, Stephen was home. He was the one who just answered the door. Lieutenant Downs glanced over at the other officer again, and they both looked like they might start laughing. Stephen lying to their face and then just walking off was really strange. The middle-aged man invited Downs and the other officer inside the home and led them to the front room, where Stephen was now sitting on the couch. Downs immediately asked Stephen why he just pretended to be somebody else. And without missing a beat, Stephen said he was on probation for burglary and he'd violated his probation. So now he was just trying to dodge the cops. Downs told him that was not very smart, but he said they were here about something far more serious than Stephen breaking his probation. They were here because Stephen's wife had been murdered in the Target parking lot right after she had met up with him. Stephen got off the couch and his attitude completely changed. He looked terrified and he asked where his son was. Was Carson okay? Downs assured him Carson was safe and that he had not been hurt. Police had already taken him to stay with Heather's grandfather for the time being. Stephen collapsed on the couch and tried to catch his breath. Downs gave him a few minutes to collect himself and then asked him about his relationship with Heather. Stephen struggled to focus, but he admitted he had not been a great husband. He had cheated on Heather, and he'd given her a really hard time about child custody during most of the divorce process. But he said he'd finally cut all of that out and had agreed to let Heather have full custody of Carson. And he said no matter how badly they might have fought about stuff, he never would have hurt Heather. Downs said they could wrap things up, at least for now. He just needed to know where Stephen went after meeting Heather at that Target. Stephen said he met up with his girlfriend and then they got his car washed. After that, he came home to his mom's house and just hung out by himself because his mom was away visiting her parents. Downs could check with the girlfriend about the car wash, but Stephen had no real alibi for where he went after that. Still, Downs knew pinning down exactly where Stephen had been wouldn't necessarily help the investigation, because unless Stephen had the ability to be two places at once, he was not the one who pulled the trigger. So Downs told Stephen they'd follow up if they needed to, and then he and the other officer left the house and went back to the station. Sitting in his office, Downs felt conflicted. He thought Stephen could have paid someone to kill Heather because of the divorce, and in addition to that, Downs now knew Stephen had violated probation for another crime. But Downs had also seen how upset Stephen got when he thought something might have happened to his son, and Downs just felt like he couldn't be faking that. So, Downs began going back over the list of people Heather's parents had given him, and something hit him right away. And he admitted to himself it seemed pretty obvious. If Heather's husband didn't kill her, maybe her boyfriend did. Later that day, an officer led Heather's boyfriend, Mike Vickers, into an interview room at the station, where Lieutenant Downs was waiting. And right away, Downs noticed Mike's slight size. He was about 5 foot 7 inches tall and he was slender, just like the suspect on the Target surveillance video. Mike sat across from Downs in the small, bright room, and Downs casually asked him what he had done the past weekend, almost like this was a conversation between two friends just catching up. Mike said on Saturday night, he and Heather had gone to his parents' house for game night. It was something they did on a lot of weekends. And on Sunday morning, they ate breakfast together before Heather headed out to church, and he went into work. Following up with Mike's employer to check if he'd really been there would be easy enough, so Downs shifted his focus. He asked Mike about the custody swaps between Heather and Stephen. Did he know how they worked? Did Heather say anything about the custody swap this past Sunday? Mike said he had actually gone to one of these custody swaps in the past, so he knew exactly how they worked. The swap he had gone to had been one when Heather was still kind of freaked out about meeting Stephen alone. Mike had driven to the Target with her, and he ran into the store to grab a few things before Stephen got there. But by the time he was leaving the store, Stephen had arrived and was handing the baby to Heather. So Mike had just hung back and watched from a distance. Lieutenant Downs sat quietly, just looking at Mike for a minute. This was a guy who fit the description of the killer, at least in part. He also knew exactly where Heather would be at the time of the shooting, and he most likely knew the layout of the Target parking lot and the surrounding area, because he had been there before. So Downs asked Mike if there had been any problems or tension lately between him and Heather. But Mike said he loved Heather, and that their relationship was awesome. They almost never fought, and they had even been talking about having kids and buying a house together. Not long after that, Downs finished up the interview and told Mike he was free to go. On the surface, Mike had seemed to be telling the truth about his and Heather's relationship, but that definitely wasn't enough for Downs to eliminate him as a suspect. After all, boyfriends could get jealous and do really stupid things, even if they were in a good relationship. And Downs knew if he could just get a clearer picture of the man from the surveillance video, he would know if Mike was the shooter or not. After the interview with Mike, Downs called the security director at Target to see when the enhanced images from the video would be ready. The security director said he had sent the footage off to the lab, but it would take at least a week for the lab technicians to finish their work. The idea of waiting around to get these images did not sit well with Downs. He wanted to keep moving forward, and he knew there had been a whole parking lot full of people who had at least caught a glimpse of the suspected killer. That evening, still only about 24 hours after the murder, Downs had his team bring in as many people who had witnessed the shooting as they could. And Downs had all these witnesses sit with a sketch artist who then drew a composite based on the descriptions of the killer that the witnesses provided. But when Downs and the other investigators saw the completed drawing, they thought it might be a joke. This killer with the huge hair and big mustache looked like a caricature, or like Sonny Bono, the famous singer from the 1960s and 70s. But all of the witnesses looked at the drawing, and every one of them swore that was what the killer looked like. Downs was pretty sure he was not looking for a famous singer, so he resigned himself to the fact that he was going to have to wait for the images from the lab to get a clear picture of what this man really looked like. And this frustrated him, because he felt like until he had those images, he and his team would just be sort of treading water. But the next day, 2 days after the murder, Downs was in his office going over his notes when an officer rushed in and said he needed to come quick. A phone call had just come into the tip line, and the caller said he had seen the killer up close. Downs didn't hesitate. He got up, walked across the station, and grabbed the phone from the officer who was manning the tip line. Downs quickly introduced himself and asked the caller to tell him everything. The caller said he happened to be at that hotel that was right by the Target on the day before the shooting, and he had seen this really strange-looking guy lingering in the hotel parking lot. But that wasn't all. This weird guy was clearly staking out the area. He was looking through a pair of binoculars, and then he took a bunch of photos. And then when the guy was done taking the photos, he hopped in a Ford F-150 pickup truck and took off. Downs, who prided himself on almost always remaining calm, felt a huge rush of excitement. He asked the caller if he managed to get the truck's license plate number. But the caller said he didn't. However, he said the truck was white, and it had a really distinctive black trim all around it. Downs got even more excited. A license plate number would have been perfect, but this description was still huge. Downs got the caller's info and then hung up the phone. He quickly gathered his team, and they ran a search through motor vehicle records for all the white Ford F-150s registered in the county. And when Downs saw the name of one of the people who owned a Ford F-150 in town, he thought he might have just found Heather's killer. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Downs drove through a quiet suburban neighborhood with the hotel witness sitting next to him in the passenger seat. Downs spotted the house he was looking for and stopped the car. He pointed to the white truck parked in the driveway, and the hotel witness looked at it through the passenger side window. And when he saw it, the witness immediately said that that was the truck he'd seen the strange-looking man get into at the hotel. There was no mistaking the distinct black trim all around it. Downs said that was great news. He thanked the witness for coming along, then he hit the gas and sped away from the house. The following day, which was only 3 days after the shooting, police got a search warrant for the house where the white truck was parked, and they impounded the truck and brought it in for a forensics search. And the forensics team quickly discovered that the truck had clearly been recently cleaned, because it was absolutely immaculate inside. This made it difficult for them to find anything useful in the truck, so they sent it to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's lab to undergo trace evidence testing, hoping the state lab might be able to find something that they couldn't. In the meantime, Downs and his team cataloged everything they had taken when they searched the house where the white truck had been found. And the more evidence Downs saw, the more confident he became that he had found the killer. Still, Downs wanted to make sure his case was airtight before he made an arrest. He didn't want to bring the killer into police custody just to have the district attorney's office tell him that the case wasn't strong enough to argue in court. But Downs didn't have to wait too long to get another big piece of evidence. A little over a week after the murder, the Target lab sent the enhanced surveillance images to Downs. And as the lieutenant looked at these images, he saw something that he believed would help him close this case. On the afternoon that Lieutenant Downs got the images, he led Heather's estranged husband, Stephen, into one of the station's interview rooms. Downs sat Stephen down at a table that had a laptop sitting on it. Downs flipped open the laptop and pulled up several images. He told him that these were enhanced images that had been pulled from Target surveillance footage taken on the evening Heather was killed. Downs leaned in and asked Stephen if he recognized the man with the big hair and the mustache in the images. Stephen stared at the screen, and then he dropped his head and looked down at the floor. Without looking up at Downs, he just said he did recognize this man. Lieutenant Downs felt like this investigation had just been wrapped up in a nice little bow. He knew it would still take time to compile all the evidence and put together the strongest case possible, but in that moment, Downs was sure that he knew who killed Heather Strube. Based on the parking lot surveillance images, suspect and witness interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Heather on the evening of April 26, 2009. At around 6 p.m., the killer crouched down behind a row of parked cars at the edge of the Target parking lot, tightened the messenger bag slung over their shoulder, and watched Heather and Stephen's custody swap. When Heather started putting baby Carson into her car, the killer began walking fast right towards her. Heather heard the killer's footsteps approaching, and she turned around to see this bizarre-looking man standing there. The killer spoke, and it frightened Heather. So much so that she turned and tried to open up her driver's side door to get away, but the killer immediately pushed themselves between Heather and her SUV, and then before Heather could even call out for help, the killer reached into their bag, pulled out a revolver, pressed the muzzle right against Heather's forehead, and squeezed the trigger. There was a deafening bang, and then Heather crumpled to the ground as blood began to pour from the wound in her head. The killer heard screaming coming from all of the shoppers who had just witnessed this, but the killer did not panic. Instead, they turned and calmly walked across the Target parking lot, through the surrounding woods, and into the nearby hotel parking lot. There, the killer got into their truck that they had left parked right there, they drove off, and pulled onto the highway. Once the killer was far enough away, they peeled off their fake mustache and removed their wig. A cheap disguise, but one they knew would conceal their identity. Because neither Heather's husband nor her boyfriend killed her. Her mother-in-law, Joanna, did. It turned out Stephen's mother, Joanna, did not like Heather at all. And she had told different people on several occasions that she did not think Heather was a good mother and that Heather should not have custody of Carson. Now, Joanna was not anywhere near the top of Lieutenant Downs' suspect list when the investigation started. After all, he thought he was searching for a strange-looking man. But then, Downs discovered that the distinctive white Ford F-150 truck was registered to Joanna. And when that truck was sent to the state lab for further testing, they lifted a single fiber from the truck's interior, and that fiber was determined to be synthetic hair, most likely from a wig. So Downs started to rethink everything. Maybe that strange-looking man on the surveillance video, the suspected killer, was really a woman in disguise. And when he saw the enhanced images from Target's lab and rewatched the entire surveillance video, he was sure he was right, and that Joanna was the person in the wig and fake mustache. And when Downs showed the surveillance images to Stephen, he recognized his mother through the disguise. But even after that, Downs and his team wanted to lock their case down further, and they eventually discovered that Joanna had owned a .38 caliber Rossi revolver. Now, Joanna's gun was never actually found, but ballistics tests confirmed that a .38 caliber Rossi was one of only 2 types of revolvers that could have fired the bullet that killed Heather. And with that final piece of information, Downs and his team made their arrest. Joanna was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole in 30 years. She was prohibited from having any contact with Heather's family, including her grandson, Carson. Heather's parents were granted full custody of Carson and are raising him themselves, but they do make sure he continues to have a relationship with his father, Stephen Stroop. Police do not believe that Stephen had anything to do with Heather's murder, or that he knew his mother was involved. That is, until he saw the surveillance footage. On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed and she was pretty upset by this, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue, but as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed and he took her hand and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her, and she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that, I'm fine, she could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so, kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door, the door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. And just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that Head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane, and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look! And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute. This person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen, and he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath, and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, I'm sorry. He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag, he unzips it, and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court and he would be sentenced to life in prison.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Snowball Effect.
On the evening of December 20th, 2022, A young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well-educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over. And then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened. And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home. And then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what? I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, "Stop buying me stuff. It's fine. I totally forgive you. Everything is good." But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season, and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates. And so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, "Oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now." And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door, but before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off. And the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at. But Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't. And so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. She was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up the closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this 3rd woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her. And so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good-looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him, and the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive, he looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those two murders.
Crash and pull over because you glow. I don't wanna be sober. If this is a show, then you are the show closer. This overcrowded life becomes less crowded when I follow you home. The crowd is a sea, everyone is drowning, but you find me. Hope is so easy, you show that I could be. Why would you ever leave? Save a spot for us, save a spot for...
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the MrBallen's podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Runful. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen's Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen's.